Under the steady fluorescent lights of a modest neighborhood pharmacy tucked away in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, two strangers stood quietly in the same narrow aisle, each completely absorbed in their own private struggles and entirely unaware of the other's presence. One was Eleanor Thompson, a gentle 73-year-old retired schoolteacher whose hands trembled slightly as she held up a small white box of heart medication and stared at the price tag printed in bold black numbers, $847. In her worn leather purse, she carried exactly $87, every last cent she could spare that month. The other person was Senator John Neely Kennedy, also 73, a longtime United States from the state of Louisiana, who was leaning forward slightly, squinting at the tiny print on his own prescription bottle, while a familiar flare-up of arthritis sent sharp, throbbing pain through his right shoulder and down into his fingers. Kennedy had spent the better part of the morning inside the Louisiana state capitol, moving through back-to-back committee meetings and conference calls with his colleagues in Washington. The arthritis had chosen that particular day to remind him of its presence, making it difficult to lift his arm smoothly or grip documents without discomfort. During one heated discussion about funding for rural health clinics, he had felt the familiar stiffness creep in, yet he continued speaking with the same steady, no-nonsense voice that had become his trademark in the Senate. After the session ended, several staff members offered to pick up his medication for him, but John had gently declined. "Appreciate it," he said with a small smile, "but I'll take care of this one myself." He believed strongly in handling his own affairs whenever possible. That sense of self-reliance had been drilled into him growing up in Zachary, Louisiana, where his father worked long, grueling shifts at a local manufacturing plant, and his mother carefully stretched every paycheck to feed and clothe their family. Those early years taught him that hard work, personal responsibility, and quiet determination were the foundations of a meaningful life. So he had parked a few blocks from the pharmacy and walked the distance on foot, the warm, humid Louisiana air pressing against him as he moved past familiar streets lined with live oaks and blooming crepe myrtles. Each step sent a dull ache through his shoulder, but he kept going, just as he had kept going through decades of public service, from local politics to the United States Senate, where he had fought tirelessly for practical solutions on health care access, education reform, and economic opportunity for working families across the bayous, farmlands, and small towns of his beloved state. By the time Kennedy pushed open the glass door of the pharmacy, his shirt was slightly damp from the walk, and the pain in his shoulder had settled into a steady throb. The cool blast of air conditioning offered immediate relief, and he paused for a moment to catch his breath. He looked around the quiet store, relieved that no one seemed to recognize him yet. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and an old ball cap pulled low over his forehead, and he looked like any other older gentleman running a routine errand. There were days when the constant attention that came with being felt exhausting, and today he welcomed the anonymity. He wanted nothing more than to be plain John Kennedy from Zachary for a little while, not the man whose every statement was analyzed on cable news, or whose schedule was filled with endless demands. He moved slowly down the medication aisle, his mind still turning over the morning's discussions about expanding access to affordable prescriptions for seniors and low-income families. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, who had spent years advocating for better healthcare policies, now personally dealing with the very kind of physical limitation that so many of his constituents faced every day. He carefully turned the prescription bottle in his aching hand, determined not to let the arthritis dictate his pace or his independence. At the far end of that same aisle, Eleanor Thompson stood motionless, her heart beating faster as she continued to stare at the price tag on the heart medication box. She had left her small, tidy one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Baton Rouge earlier that morning, following the same quiet morning routine she had maintained ever since her husband Harold passed away 5 years earlier. 40 years of teaching in Baton Rouge's public schools had instilled in her the habit of rising early, so she had brewed a small pot of coffee in her tiny kitchen and sat by the window, watching the quiet street outside while Harold's framed photograph rested in its usual place on the nightstand. The soft morning light always fell gently across his smiling face in that picture, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to remember happier times. The laughter they shared, the weekend drives through the countryside, and the pride they both felt when their students succeeded. But those memories faded quickly when reality returned. Her monthly pension totaled $1,847, a fixed amount that had to cover rent of $650, utilities, basic groceries, phone service, and health insurance. The generic version of her essential heart medication had been discontinued by the manufacturer several months ago, leaving her with no choice but to consider the expensive brand name alternative. When the pharmacist first quoted her the price of $847, Eleanor had let out a short, bitter laugh, born purely from shock and helplessness. That single bottle would consume nearly half of everything she received each month. How could she possibly afford it while still keeping a roof over her head and food on the table? For the past 3 months, Eleanor had been surviving on one modest meal a day, usually nothing more than a slice of bread with tea in the morning. Some evenings she would prepare a small portion of pasta, but most days she simply went without dinner to make her limited grocery budget last longer. At night, she layered extra blankets on her bed to avoid turning up the heat, hoping to save a few dollars on the utility bill. Last month, the landlord had slid a polite but firm notice under her door, reminding her that the rent was 15 days overdue and that legal proceedings would begin if payment was not received soon. She had read the note once, folded it neatly, and buried it at the bottom of a drawer, as if hiding the paper could somehow make the problem disappear. Her daughter Jennifer, who lived several states away, called every week to check on her mother. Each time, Eleanor answered with the same calm, reassuring lie. "I'm doing just fine, sweetheart. You focus on those grandbabies, and don't worry about me." She could never bring herself to tell Jennifer the truth. Her daughter already carried heavy responsibilities, raising 2 young children while her husband struggled with repeated job layoffs. So adding her own financial troubles to that burden felt unthinkable. So Eleanor carried the weight silently, the same way she had once stayed late after school to tutor children who were falling behind, never complaining about her own exhaustion or the limited resources in her classroom. She had dedicated 4 decades of her life to teaching, pouring her heart into helping thousands of young minds learn to read, to write, and, most importantly, to believe in themselves, even when circumstances were difficult. Education, she firmly believed, was the most powerful tool for lifting people out of hardship. Now, standing alone in the pharmacy aisle, she felt her knees grow weak and her eyes begin to blur with tears she desperately tried to hold back. The doctor had been very clear during her last visit. Without consistent use of this medication, the risks to her heart could become serious within the next several months. Yet paying for it seemed completely out of reach. The years of quiet sacrifice, of always putting others first, of smiling through hardship for the sake of her students and her family, had left her feeling small, tired, and profoundly alone in that brightly lit aisle. The 2 individuals remained separated by only a few feet of shelving filled with cough syrups, pain relievers, and bandages, each carrying burdens that no one else in the store could see. Kennedy flexed his sore fingers around the prescription bottle, his thoughts drifting to the many families he had met throughout Louisiana who struggled every month to afford the medications their doctors prescribed. The arthritis flare-up served as a personal reminder that even those who had dedicated their lives to public service were not immune to the physical challenges that come with age. Eleanor Thompson, meanwhile, continued to grip the heart medication box tightly, her mind replaying scenes from her classroom days, the bright faces of children who had once looked up to her with hope, and the quiet pride she felt when former students returned years later to thank her. The soft hum of the pharmacy's air conditioning mixed with the occasional murmur of other customers, and the distant beep of the cash register, creating a calm but indifferent backdrop to the silent emotional storms unfolding at either end of the aisle. Neither Eleanor nor Kennedy could possibly know that within the next few minutes their paths would cross in a simple, unexpected way. A small accident, a kind instinctive gesture, and a few honest words would soon bridge the distance between a respected and a retired teacher, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring renewed hope, dignity, and purpose back into Eleanor's life, while reminding of the profound impact one act of genuine human kindness can have. In that ordinary pharmacy in Baton Rouge, under those ordinary lights, two very different lives shaped by service, sacrifice, and quiet resilience were quietly moving toward a moment that would change them both forever. A soft clatter broke the quiet hum of the pharmacy aisle. John Neely Kennedy had reached for another bottle on the higher shelf when a sudden sharp twinge shot through his arthritic shoulder. His fingers, already stiff from the flare-up, lost their grip, and the plastic bottle slipped, bounced once on the edge of the shelf, and tumbled to the tiled floor with a dull thud, rolling a few inches before coming to rest near Eleanor Thompson's feet. Without thinking, Eleanor bent down. 40 years of classroom instinct took over. The same quick, caring response she had used countless times when a student dropped a pencil, spilled crayons, or needed a steady hand during a difficult lesson. Her knees protested the movement, but she ignored them, gathered the fallen bottle, and straightened up slowly. "Here you go, sir," she said gently, extending the medication toward him. Her voice carried the calm, patient tone of a lifelong teacher. Kennedy turned, his face showing a mix of mild embarrassment and gratitude. Up close, but the lines around his eyes spoke of long hours and many battles fought in quiet rooms. He accepted the bottle with his left hand, the right one still aching. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his Louisiana drawl warm and unpretentious. "These hands aren't cooperating like they used to. Arthritis has a way of reminding you who's really in charge." Eleanor offered a small, understanding smile. "I know the feeling. Getting older comes with its own set of surprises, doesn't it?" They stood there for a moment, two older adults sharing a brief, ordinary exchange in the middle of a busy day. But something in the woman's eyes caught the Ez's attention. They looked tired, not just from lack of sleep, but from a deeper kind of weariness. He had seen that look before, many times, in town halls across Louisiana, or in the faces of constituents who carried burdens too heavy to speak aloud. It was the look of someone fighting hard just to keep standing. Eleanor studied the man in front of her more carefully now. There was something familiar about his face. The thoughtful expression, the straightforward way he spoke. Then it clicked. She had seen him on television many times, debating issues with that same plain-spoken honesty that made him stand out in Washington. This was John Neely Kennedy, the man from Zachary who had risen through Louisiana politics with a reputation for common sense and straight talk. Her eyes widened slightly in quiet recognition, but there was no excited gasp or request for a photo. Instead, a gentle sadness softened her features, as if seeing him here, in this ordinary setting, It had stirred memories she hadn't visited in a long while. Kennedy noticed the change in her expression. He was used to the moment when people realized who he was. The quick spark of surprise, the sudden rush of words. But this woman's reaction was different. There was no excitement, only a quiet sorrow that seemed to pull her somewhere far away. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind today," he said kindly, keeping his voice low so as not to draw attention from other shoppers. "Everything all right?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the heart medication box she still held. She hadn't planned to speak to anyone, least of all a United States, but something in his steady, respectful gaze made the walls she had built around her struggles feel a little thinner. I was just trying to figure things out," she admitted softly. "This medicine, it's for my heart. The price is $847. I only have 87 with me. I thought maybe if I looked again, the numbers would change." She gave a small, self-conscious laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Silly, I know." Kennedy's expression grew serious. He glanced at the box in her hands, then back at her face. The despair he saw there struck a deep chord. It reminded him of his own childhood in Zachary. Nights when his parents sat at the kitchen table worrying about how to pay the doctor after his father's back injury at the plant, or how to stretch groceries when work was slow. He had watched his mother hide her tears so the children wouldn't see. That same quiet desperation lived in Eleanor Thompson's eyes now. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said sincerely. "No one should have to choose between medicine and keeping a roof over their head. Mind if I ask your name?" "Eleanor Thompson," she replied. "I taught school here in Baton Rouge for over 40 years, 4th and 5th grade mostly. Reading, writing, trying to give kids a fighting chance." Kennedy's face softened further. "A teacher," he repeated with genuine respect. "One of the most important jobs there is. I've volunteered as a substitute teacher in Louisiana public schools myself over the years. There's nothing quite like seeing a child's eyes light up when something finally clicks." For the next several minutes, the aisle felt smaller, more intimate. Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about Harold, how he had been her rock, how they had built a modest but happy life together, and how empty the apartment felt after he was gone. She spoke of the pension that never quite stretched far enough, the careful budgeting, the skipped meals, and the landlord's notice she kept hidden in a drawer. She even mentioned her daughter Jennifer and the guilt she felt for not being completely honest during their weekly calls. "I've always been the one helping others," she said quietly, her voice catching. "Students, colleagues, neighbors. Now I feel like I'm the one who needs help, and I don't know how to ask for it without feeling like I've failed somehow." Kennedy listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his arthritic hand resting gently on the shelf for support. "I grew up in Zachary," he said at last, his voice steady but warm. "My dad worked hard in the factories there. My mom did whatever it took to keep food on the table. We didn't have much, but we had each other and a strong sense of pride. I remember watching my parents make impossible choices sometimes. That look you have right now, I've seen it before. It stays with you." He paused, then added with a small, wry smile, "And here I am, who's spent years fighting for better health care and more support for working families, standing in a pharmacy with a shoulder that won't cooperate. Life has a way of keeping us humble." Eleanor looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the public figure, but the man. Someone who understood struggle from personal experience, even if his path had taken him far from those early days. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely invisible. As they continued talking softly, the distance between a powerful and a retired teacher began to dissolve. What had started with a dropped bottle was slowly turning into something more meaningful, the beginning of a connection built on shared humanity, quiet respect, and the simple recognition that no one should have to face their hardest battles entirely alone. In that ordinary pharmacy aisle in Baton Rouge, under the same fluorescent lights, two lives that seemed worlds apart were quietly drawing closer, setting the stage for a moment of generosity that neither of them could yet foresee. John Neely Kennedy stood quietly for a long moment after Eleanor finished speaking. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, the skipped meals, the hidden rent notice, the quiet pride of a woman who had spent 4 decades giving everything she had to other people's children, only to find herself struggling alone in her later years. He looked down at the heart medication box, still clutched tightly in her hands, then back at her tired but dignified face. Without saying anything at first, he reached out gently and took the box from her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying that familiar Louisiana cadence. "How much did you say this costs again?" Eleanor's shoulders tensed. She looked away, embarrassed. $847, she whispered. "It's okay. I'll figure something out. Maybe they have a payment plan or... I don't know. I shouldn't have said anything." But Kennedy didn't hand the box back. Instead, he turned toward the prescription counter at the end of the aisle, his arthritic shoulder protesting with every step. Eleanor followed quickly, her heart racing. "Please," she said, touching his arm lightly. "You don't have to do this. I'm just a retired teacher. You don't even know me." He stopped and turned to face her fully. His eyes were calm but determined, the same look he wore when fighting for a tough bill on the Senate floor. "I may not have known you an hour ago," he replied, "but I know your story now, and I know what it feels like when the world starts closing in and you feel like you have nowhere left to turn. I've seen it in too many good people back home in Zachary, in Baton Rouge, and all across this state. Teachers like you built the foundation for generations of Louisianans. You don't deserve to choose between medicine and survival." Before Eleanor could protest again, Kennedy stepped up to the counter. The young pharmacist, a woman in her late 20s, looked up and immediately recognized him. Her eyes widened slightly, but she remained professional. "I'd like to pay for both prescriptions," Kennedy said clearly, placing Eleanor's heart medication and his own anti-inflammatory bottle on the counter. Together, the pharmacist rang up the total. $1,247. Without hesitation, Kennedy pulled out his wallet and handed over his card. As the machine processed the payment, Eleanor stood beside him, her hands shaking. When the pharmacist handed over the 2 white bags, Kennedy took Eleanor's and gently placed it in her hands. "Here," he said simply. "This one's yours. I'd start taking it today, just like the doctor told you." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. She stared at the bag as if it were something precious and fragile. "I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's too much. You have important work to do. Why would you do this for someone you just met?" Kennedy leaned against the counter for a moment, giving his shoulder a brief rest, then looked directly into her eyes. "Because I can," he answered quietly. "And because I remember what it feels like when help doesn't come. My family didn't have much when I was growing up. There were times my parents had to decide which bills to pay and which ones could wait. I went into public service so fewer families would have to make those choices. Today, I get to live that belief in a very personal way." He paused, then continued with a small, warm smile. "Besides, You helped me first. You didn't have to bend down and pick up that bottle when my shoulder gave out. You did it without thinking, the same way you probably helped thousands of kids who dropped their books or needed extra time with their reading. Today, it's my turn to help you. That's how it should work sometimes." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still holding the pharmacy bag tightly against her chest. "I taught for 40 years, she said softly. "I used to tell my students that kindness costs nothing, but can change everything. I never thought I'd be on the receiving end of it like this." Kennedy nodded. "That's the thing about kindness. It works both ways. You gave it freely for decades. Now it's come back to you when you needed it most." They walked slowly out of the pharmacy together, stepping into the warm afternoon light of Baton Rouge. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the parking lot and painting the live oaks in golden hues. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a small crack in the heavy wall of worry she had been carrying. As they stood near the entrance, Kennedy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. He wrote something on the back with his left hand, his right one still too sore to hold the pen comfortably. "This is my personal assistant's direct number," he said, handing her the card. "Call him tomorrow morning. I'm going to speak with him tonight and with some people I know who run support programs for seniors and educators in Louisiana. We're going to make sure you don't have to worry about this medication again. There are foundations and assistance programs that can cover ongoing costs for people in your situation. You won't have to choose between rent and your health anymore." Eleanor looked down at the card, then back up at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and gratitude. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have just walked away after paying for the medicine." Kennedy shrugged slightly, careful of his shoulder. "Because someone once helped my family when we were struggling, and it made all the difference. Because I believe that if you're in a position to lift someone up, you should do it. And because a good teacher like you still has so much to give. Louisiana needs teachers like you, even in retirement. We're not done with you yet, Mrs. Thompson." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor stepped forward and wrapped her arms around in a gentle, heartfelt hug. It was the kind of hug a teacher might give a student who had finally succeeded after months of struggle. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Kennedy replied softly, "by letting me help." They stood there together for another minute, two people from very different walks of life, connected by a simple act of human decency. Around them, cars passed by and people went about their day, unaware that inside this small moment, something important had shifted. As Eleanor finally stepped back, clutching both the medication bag and the business card, Kennedy gave her one last encouraging nod. "Go home and take your medicine, Mrs. Thompson. Rest well tonight. Tomorrow is going to be a better day. I promise you that." Eleanor nodded, tears still shining in her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope rather than despair. She watched as they walked slowly back toward his car, his posture straight despite the pain in his shoulder. In that quiet parking lot in Baton Rouge, under the fading Louisiana sun, a retired teacher who had given so much of her life to others finally received a gift she never expected. Not just medicine, but the restoration of dignity, the feeling of being seen, and the quiet promise that she would not have to fight alone anymore. The collision of their two worlds in that pharmacy aisle had set in motion a new chapter, one neither of them could have predicted when they first stepped through those doors earlier that day. 3 years had passed since that ordinary afternoon in the Baton Rouge pharmacy, yet for Eleanor Thompson, it felt like an entirely different lifetime. At 76, She no longer woke up to the heavy weight of fear that had once pressed on her chest every morning. Instead, she rose with purpose, dressed in comfortable clothes suitable for active work with children, and drove to West Baton Rouge Parish, where she now spent 2 fulfilling days each week at Louisiana Key Academy, a tuition-free public charter school dedicated to students with dyslexia and other language-based learning differences. The position had come through Kennedy's quiet intervention. True to his word, he had called his assistant that same evening after their meeting. Within days, Eleanor received a call from the school's director. They needed an experienced reading specialist for their early intervention program, someone patient, warm, and skilled at helping children who struggled to decode words and build confidence. The role came with a modest but steady salary, full health insurance, and, most importantly, complete coverage for her heart medication through a partnership program they had helped facilitate. At first, Eleanor had doubted herself. "I'm 73, she had told the director during the interview. "My knees aren't what they used to be, and I've been out of the classroom for years." But the director had smiled and replied, "Mrs. Thompson, Kennedy told us about your 40 years in public schools. He said you have the kind of heart and patience these children need. Age is just a number when the light is still burning." That light had indeed returned. On her first day, Eleanor stood in a bright, colorful classroom with 8 eager but frustrated young faces looking up at her. Some children avoided eye contact. Others fidgeted constantly, all of them carrying the invisible scars of feeling behind or not smart enough in regular classrooms. Eleanor remembered her own early teaching days in overcrowded Baton Rouge schools and smiled the same calm, reassuring smile she had perfected decades ago. "Hello, everyone," she said warmly, sitting down at their level instead of standing at the front. "My name is Mrs. Thompson, and today I want to share a secret with you. Reading isn't about being fast or perfect right away, and it's about patience, practice, and believing you can do it. One small step at a time. And guess what? I have a lot of patience to share." The children slowly began to relax. Over the following weeks and months, Eleanor worked with them using multi-sensory techniques, gentle encouragement, and the same storytelling magic that had once captivated her 4th and 5th graders. She celebrated every small victory. A child sounding out a new word, another reading a full sentence without stopping, a quiet student finally raising their hand. In return, the children gave her something priceless: purpose, laughter, and the daily reminder that her life was far from over. Kennedy had stayed in touch. He visited the school twice a year, always without fanfare. On one memorable spring morning, he sat cross-legged on the colorful rug with the children and shared simple stories from his own childhood in Zachary. How he had struggled with certain subjects but kept working hard. How teachers had believed in him when he doubted himself. The children listened wide-eyed, especially when he admitted that even S sometimes need help from others. On that particular visit, after the stories, he turned to Eleanor with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Thompson, would you mind if I joined you for today's reading circle?" Together, they led the group through a favorite children's book. Kennedy's voice, steady and warm with his natural Louisiana drawl, brought the characters to life. When one little boy named Marcus, who had once refused to read aloud, bravely sounded out a difficult sentence, the entire room erupted in applause. And Eleanor's eyes met the as across the circle, and they shared a quiet, knowing look. No words were needed. Now, 3 years later, Eleanor worked only 2 days a week to protect her knees and energy. She still lived in the same small apartment, but it felt different, brighter, warmer. The rent was manageable. The pantry stayed stocked. Most importantly, She no longer lay awake at night wondering how she would survive another month. On her living room wall hung two photographs side by side. One showed Harold at his retirement party years ago, smiling proudly. The other captured Eleanor and Kennedy standing together in the school garden, both laughing as children played around them. Whenever friends or family asked what had changed her life, Eleanor always gave the same answer: a dropped medicine bottle in a pharmacy aisle. And sometimes the smallest moments lead to the biggest blessings. One warm autumn afternoon, Kennedy made another unannounced visit to the school. He found Eleanor in her classroom, helping a young girl trace letters in sand while sounding them out. He waited quietly until the lesson ended, then approached with his familiar, straightforward manner. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "you look like you're right where you belong." Eleanor stood and took his hand warmly. "Thanks to you. I can never thank you enough." Kennedy shook his head gently. "You don't owe me thanks. You're the one doing the real work here. These kids are learning to read because of your patience and heart. That's the kind of legacy that lasts." They walked together through the school garden as the children played nearby. The shoulders still bothered him from time to time, but he moved with the same quiet determination that had defined his life. As they sat on a bench under a shady oak, he spoke thoughtfully. "You know, Eleanor, I've spent most of my adult life in politics, debating bills, arguing over budgets, trying to make government work better for people. But moments like the one we shared in that pharmacy remind me of something more important. Real change often happens person to person, not just through laws. One act of kindness, one moment of seeing someone else's struggle and choosing to help, that can ripple outward in ways we never expect." Eleanor nodded, watching a group of children laughing as they practiced reading simple signs posted around the garden. "I used to think asking for help was a sign of weakness," she said softly. "Now I understand it takes strength to accept kindness, just as it takes strength to offer it. You taught me that. And these children, they're teaching me every day that no one is beyond hope. Even when things feel impossible, a little patience and belief from someone else can light the way." Kennedy smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with quiet satisfaction. "That's the lesson, isn't it? We all have the power to make a difference, no matter our title, our age, or our circumstances. Whether you're A from Zachary or a retired teacher from Baton Rouge, the real measure of a life well lived isn't how high you climb or how much you accumulate. It's how many times you choose to lift someone else up when they're struggling to stand." He paused, looking out at the children playing. "Louisiana has always been a state of strong, resilient people. Folks who help their neighbors, who believe in hard work and second chances. If we carry that spirit forward, if each of us looks for opportunities to show simple human kindness, we can build a better future for every child in these classrooms and beyond. Education, compassion, and personal responsibility aren't just political talking points. They're the foundation of a decent society." Eleanor reached over and gently squeezed his hand. "You didn't just help me buy medicine that day," she said. "You helped me remember who I still am. A teacher. Someone who matters. And because of that, these children get to believe in themselves a little more each day." As the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, the two friends, one a United States, the other a dedicated educator, sat in comfortable silence. Around them, and the sounds of children learning, laughing, and growing filled the air. It was a perfect reminder that sometimes the Prince of the Senate, like any ordinary person, could become the brightest light in someone else's darkness. And if you asked Eleanor Thompson today what truly changed her life, she would smile and tell you the same simple truth. It all started with a medicine bottle falling to the floor. One stranger saw another's pain and chose to act with kindness. That single choice proved that no one is too old to start again, no struggle is too great to overcome with help, and the greatest power any of us possess is the willingness to care, truly care, about the person standing beside us in life's journey. In the heart of Baton Rouge, under Louisiana's warm sky, a retired teacher had found renewed purpose. B.A. had reaffirmed his deepest values, and a group of children were learning to read their way toward brighter futures, all because two strangers met by chance and chose humanity over indifference. That is the quiet, powerful lesson this story leaves behind. True greatness isn't measured by titles or wealth. It is measured by how we treat one another when no one is watching, by our willingness to see struggle in another's eyes and respond with compassion, by remembering that every life has value, every person has potential, and every act of genuine kindness can rewrite someone's entire future. In the end, we are all just people trying to make it through the day. And sometimes, the smallest gesture, a helping hand, a listening ear, and a decision to pay for medicine becomes the turning point that reminds us what it truly means to be human.